말해. 당저 네바 단 제뇨모바다 뇨모바 기비기 동아다 대도 나서봐 아니 개와다 기비 제부 대도 나서봐 간이 제위네 차상 유나 견래 되네 주바마도 유나 견라 강라마 되바제 랑교 랑왕기 돈에 여바지 가요 말레스 세상디네자 견디게나 안 견디게 직접이 개벌 제고스베 삼로메나야 그런게 유긴 초어도 네 제보디기 봐 두고래 해서지 생각도 내가 쉬로다 그지.
Good evening. So last week we were looking at how afflictions and suffering, as well as virtue and happiness, all arises independent on causes and conditions, not under its own power. And when the required causes and conditions are accumulated, the result will come about. Would expressed in an opposite way, every result experienced comes about independent on its required causes and conditions being gathered. We also looked at how causes and conditions themselves, they have no particular thought about leading to a result, but by causes and conditions coming together, the result nevertheless follows. In other words, the causes and conditions aren't under their own power, but rather, naturally, independence on the gathering of causes and conditions, the result follows. So too, a result doesn't arise under its own power, but it too has come about independent on those causes and conditions. So therefore, both causes and results are not under their own power.
Rangwando yu me se di sheba de karsungo se rangwando yu se de ngobu duji gi chue kaneshina gyudan jinle ma de ba chi yo ma re se orda rangwando me se de gyudan jinle de ne gi go re se jizada rangwando yu na jebu rangwando yu ba ina gyudan jinle kan la ma de ba chi ni jebu chi chu go re se de ne gi jebu chi yo ma re se orda ga ji rangwa yo ma re duji gi chue kaneshina ngobu kaneshina gyudan jinle de ne du go re ma do 유단见了嘛对吧就没吧人家的让我有嘛让我的也没写的现实了对吧人家让我的没吧的当然嘛对吧去约会呢约吧人家但让我的约吧是结果的
So we spoke last week then about this process of being under, so I'll translate the same term in three ways, under its own control or own power, as being of its free will, or having freedom. So we looked at this to show that nothing is under its own freedom. No, so we looked at it in the context, I'll say it again, we looked at it in the context of all either functioning things or compounded phenomena, impermanent phenomena. These all come about independent on causes and conditions. They do not arise, or they do not come about under their own free will, or with freedom, or under their own control, but independence on causes and conditions. And as mentioned in the previous segment, a result comes about independence on its causes and conditions, not under its own free volition or its free will. Likewise, causes and conditions, they do not have the intent to lead to a result, but nevertheless, independence on causes and conditions, result follows. So there's nowhere in this process is any component under its own free volition.
교조에서 가면 다가랑 거 당보 간에 순에 다가랑 이거 어디 딱 봤어야 돼. 지상 따바 코로나 라와 요 말했어야 돼. 따와 따바 라와도 요 말했어야 돼. 그 기지기지기 지네 라와 요 말시고 말해. 유단 긴le 뛰고 어렸으니 근데 라와 요 봤시고 말해. 따바 라와 매버리 했어야 돼. 따바셔야 돼. 현지를 뛰네 샤오면 기지기지 집은 미다바디면은 딱바세 샤야요 말에. 세상 딱바세 샤야디 기지기지 집은 미다발로 뛰네다 미지바레세 딱바세 샤고를. 제가 딱바세 샤야디는 미다발로 뛰네 샤고를. 직질을 뛰네 샤고요 봐서 근데 그 딱바세 상황이요 말에세 디세고. 네 디싱메 딱바세디 미다바지를 여바 인자데 딱바세 샤야요래. 기지기지 집어 지어봐 인산 될라 뛰네 아니 기지기지 미시바들 딱바스 샤고레스 제산데 기지기지 집어들 뛰네 나 딱바스 샤고레스 딱바스 샤야디 기지기지 집에 미다발 뛰네 뛰어봐 인산 아니 라와 유명하래스 그래.
So last week we concentrated on, and again I'll use three different terms, but the meaning comes down to the same thing. Impermanent phenomena, compounded phenomena, functioning things. So now to talk about the second category of phenomena, that of permanent phenomena. And permanent, the meaning is unchanging. It doesn't change momentarily, because in English it also has the meaning of everlasting. That is not the meaning in Buddhism. The meaning is unchanging. It doesn't change momentarily. So to talk then about permanent phenomena, these two are do not have any freedom. They're not under their own power or have free will. They are also dependent. So they are not, it's not that they are dependent on causes like impermanent phenomena. Rather, they are interdependent or mutually dependent in that for something to be permanent, there necessarily needs to be something impermanent. There is a mutual dependency that to call something permanent, there needs to be something impermanent. Or to use synonyms, for something to be unchanging, there needs to be something changing. So there is a mutual dependency between these two contrary forms of existing, unchanging and changing.
Indeed. Latina she ko takwa se di kareli ko takwa se yue da me se di kareli de shower ne takwa chemi jubi chema ji yue ba inen takwa de yue ba le. takwa hago gen chema ji yue na takwa de yue ba le. hago gen chema ji me na takwa me ba le. 제가 takwa se di yue da me se ji 샤야 di 그런 또 비 체마될 때네 제고래 체마될 때네 체마디 유도 여바에서 그 여바를 딱 봐서 여바디 매나 매바래서 딱와 여다 매셔야 돼 그런 또 비 체마를 때네 뛰고 거래 세상 그런 또 비 체마될 때네 여나 그 여바를 매나 매바래서 자고 진짜 딱 봐서 돼 라와 매바디 가르스네 그 또비 체마를 뛰고 거래 마뛰어봐 체마 그런 또 비 체마를 마뛰어봐 딱 봐서 샤서 여마래서 제가 니네서 딱바세 라와 메세야 딜야 딱바 라완 메비기 줌진 삼다사로 티네스투스타이.
And a further dependency that shows that permanent or unchanging phenomena are not free, but are don't have freedom, aren't under their own control, but are actually dependent, is that for a permanent phenomenon to exist, as opposed to be non-existent, for an unchanging phenomenon to exist, it needs to be known or realized by a valid cognizer. So therefore there is a dependency for an unchanging phenomenon to be included amongst existence. It needs to be known or realized by a specific consciousness, a valid cognition. Therefore, it is dependent. An unchanging phenomenon is dependent on being known by a valid cognizer, and therefore, being dependent, it is not under its own power, its own control, its own free will, but is dependent, in this instance, dependent on being known by a valid cognizer.
데니기 마 베진나라 라와도 예 메세 근데 따바디기 유단 견라마 되비 라와레 그 규진을 뛰고 말 따바디 규진을 견을 뛰고 규진라마 되고 라와 차되래 차죠. 규제는 맞도 라와 차. 이내 라와 리베스는 라와 요 말해서 이제는 뛰고래서 되지세요. 다디 규제라 맞도 비게 라와 리베스는 규제라 맞도 바지 or 맞도 규제기 맞도 바지나 거 맞도 베체네 거 라와 납초고래. 이내 거 라와 말해서 라와도 요 말해서 다도 나랑도 라와도 예메 세디 남사 라와도 요래 요 말해서 셴라 맞도 바지 요래 요 말해서 실레고다. 셴라 맞도 바지 요나 라완도 여바래 현지라 마되버지 매나 인지미주 여바 현지를 뛰어고고 여나 아니 라완도 매바래.
So a permanent or an unchanging phenomenon to be included amongst existence, it needs to be realized or known by a valid cognizer. Therefore, it is dependent. It is not independent. So you could say that an unchanging phenomenon is free of being dependent on causes, because it doesn't require causes, but it nevertheless is not entirely free in that there is still a dependent relationship. But the dependent relationship is in terms of either mutual dependency or independence on being known by a valid cognizer. So the meaning of, again I'll use synonyms, free will or being under its own power or having freedom means that it is independent or not dependent. So if something were to exist in a manner that it is not dependent, then that existent would be said to be under its own power or have free will. But there's nothing that exists in this way.
Rāngā tu yu me se samdāna diki shen le jik tuyeba yueba tila rāngā tu me ba re. Taja shen chi la ma tuyeba chuyeba na rāngā tu yueba re sin. Tene samdāna di du chini samdā shimju che diki gari le pingu wa sin. Ān zuki tendiki namsha yakbo haqwa le pingu re. Chizāde tendiki namsha dili yakbo haqwa pingu tu. Ān zu dā me pa toya dāng tōngpa nyi namsha jeba che toya le ya. 핑거를 되게 제라 핑거를 제자디 판도 여바자 디기 마도 신다 예 라와도 메세디 계셔야디 디 핑거를.
So therefore the meaning of freedom, free will under its own power is whether something is dependent or not. If it were independent or not dependent, then it could be said to be under its own power. Because in the Tibetan, the opposite would be under the power of something else, or other powered, which means dependent. Here means dependent. So for something to be under its own power, to have free will, would mean that it is independent. So if one looks deeply, investigating to see what one can find that exists independently, one will not find anything. Things may appear to us as being independent, but one will not find anything that is dependent. So this points to part of the purpose of this presentation, which is by investigating, thinking, looking for things that exist independently, one will come to recognize nothing exists in this way, and that this therefore aids our understanding of dependence arising. And as our understanding of dependence arising deepens, goes beyond this superficial but deepens, this will aid our later realization of emptiness.
rāngā yōpa tīne chī lagu rīyé sēdi dī hā kōpa chē, dī hā kōpa tīne ngā dēn, ngā dī jīsō nā liyā, ngā rāngā yō rē, ngā rāngā yō mā rē shē dēn, tā tīne chī rē, kāne chī lagu dū, tā dī sāngī bī shū nā shē bā tī tā tūngu dī, tūngu mī dū, ngā dī jīsō nā ngā rāngā dū yō sēdi, sāngī bī shū nē shē rāngā dū yō sēdi, sāngī shū nē shī bī rāngā dī mē bā dī chā yu dē, rāngā dī yō bā dī chā yu dū, dū shī nē sām tā dī shīm chū shē dī tā.
Therefore, it's good that this becomes clear. The meaning of free will is that if something were to have free will or freedom, it would not be dependent. It would be independent, not dependent on anything at all. It would be under its own power, to use another synonym. So this is the meaning of free will. In society, we talk about it whether one is free or whether one is not free, and it has a variety of meanings in different contexts. But it's important to understand the actual meaning here in the Buddha Dharma, which to express it with a synonym would be if something is independent or dependent. If it's independent, it has free will. If it's dependent, it does not have free will.
아데마 지데다 디리마 쉐디 디리 조 시작 강되다 다제 따바 강인바 데니 다니 네 중시제 체도 삼신 중화메스.
Now continuing with the 27th verse. That which is asserted as the general principle and that which is designated as the Atman, the self, do not originate with a deliberate thought. I myself shall give rise to.
아디 라원도 예매고 기시고래. 나델이야 다양한 저기 치료바 흉나라 가르송고라스네 치료바 장전바 세야. 근데 저기 나 가르송고라스네 그런 저기다 저기다 최탐제 제법보지 수요래서네 직교래서 직이 수고래 직교래 차상이 제법을 주요래서 내가 민가라고서는 조세라기래 해서 조세 주요래서 조세디 그런 뭐 딱바래 라왕요래서 라왕도 해봐 근데 딱바 규된 길에 맞춰봐 되네기 지요래서 단 그런 규된 길에 맞춰봐 라왕도 해봐지 그때 맞춰봐지 像 수치를 뛰면 봐서 뛰 먹어봐지 그런 라왕도 요래 뭐 딱바래서 다 그런 게 차상 신고래시 하고 내수 차상 하고 거래시 하고 해야 돼. 차상 내수 차상 시기요 봐. 신 하고가 아니 딱바 라마도 연지요래 해서 일단 될 민가라선做了个지做了个做是明白지做是明白그래서
These verses now present a response to the views of the non-Buddhist Samkhya school. So the Samkhyas hold that all phenomena have a creator. I think there is a creator that creates everything that exists. This creator they call the principle or the general principle. So in Shantideva you use just the abbreviation of principle. The fuller expression is general principle. And it's translated in other ways too, but we'll stay with that. So this general principle, which is the creator of all that exists, has particular characteristics. It has free will, it is permanent or unchanging, and it is independent. So these are characteristics of the creator, which they use the term general principle, of being having free will, being unchanging or permanent, and not dependent, independent.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, I don't remember if I mentioned, and that it is all-knowing as well.
디기 넘주라만 지게 파 샤나디게 주용거래서 중국어래서 주번하신 거에 되는 수요 선비게 삼당에도 되고 되는 주번하신 직파 중국어래서 용거래서 제가 조세자 강되다서도 제가다 조세디게 되는 성미디 수요 선비 삼당에도 되는 삼당에 디기 견전 직 가리나지 주용 방한테 대화다 동화당 안내지 대화 동화 셈전 지신 나사라 소바 줄라 소바다 대차상 도시가 돼야 돼 그런 게 디딩이 수요 선배기 삼로 땅에도 디니치 고국 수요도 선배 삼 땅에도 디니치 그런 넘주름 그런 게다 주변하시 디니치 주용 거래서 디니치 주거래서 디니게 연구해 봐도 도시네 그런 저 강되다서 디니게 링거래서 or다 제라바 그런 주기 지선 조세디 라신 규단 길라마되바 코랑공원에 줍되겐 근데 딱봐 니 코차스니 수차상 시디겐 지요레스 안 디기 류 삼로 당진에 한 삼로 당유도 대단히 주용 거래서 네 그런 쪽도 신에 킬링 거래지 강도에 당세에 되지.
So when this term general principle is used, you can think of creator, because in our culture this maybe makes more sense, but because we're presenting this philosophical school, then we'll use the term principle or general principle. So how do things come into existence? All that exists comes into existence merely or solely by the general principle thinking them into existence. So by the general principle thinking of the various components in our natural environment, thinking of beings, thinking of happiness, thinking of suffering, these things manifest. So all that manifests in the world does so by the thought of the general principle. And this then is an assertion of the Samkhya school.
다 제다바 가인바 세데 다 세대가는 저기 다 세대 여러가다 다 세대가는 저기 디나신 다 세대 치료바 그런 장점 먹어 다 세간에 뒤오르시네 뭐 셰바레제 임바제 다바제 안 차상 니수 차상 하고 한 지요레스 델레미 다고 다스 다고레스 다 시리게 기부시고다 다 셰바 임바 되네게 안에지게 다바 안에 랑와유디겐 랑와유다 다 세대 규된建立 되네 깨와 말을 거다现在刚来嘛对我可能就有类似我的大些其实我大法的규된 建立对过嘛刚来对过嘛可能랑와도有把的那第但你是第单的还必须当中就有的하고 두过的现在那个就有的点了名大些来个的些的하고 그 니서 하고 지지단 디디단 디하고 너무 좋겠는데.
So that was the first line. Now the second line.
차상하고 그러면 나간지 니서 하고 간지다.这차하고 근데 차상하고 해야 말와 저는 다 세디 뭐 다바랑왕와 근데 제 니수 되니까 하고 되긴 기부시라 다 생긴다고 해서
So the second line, that which is designated as the Atman, the self. So just to say as an aside, so the term that is used is self, but I've included the Sanskrit because it's now the way it's specifically meant in these non-Buddhist schools, in this case the Samkhya. So maybe Atman is more specific, but I'll probably just still say self. It is the same word. So they say that the way the Atman or the self exists is the following: its entity is permanent or unchanging. It is a knower in that it can experience, so it's a knower. It is consciousness, and it has free will. It is not dependent on causes and conditions. It is unchanging, so permanent, and has free will. It knows and is consciousness. So this is the entity, this is entity meaning this is what it is. So what is the self or the Atman? It is unchanging, it knows, it is consciousness, it has free will, it's not dependent on causes and conditions.
제가 되니게 다 세야될 제가 되니게 다 세야될 되니 다 요래서 되니시 요래서 킬링 거다 다지 제가 다 되게 나 지게 직 통고도 선배게 아직 통고도 선배 삼로지 코로나도 안에 지조세 대시 차상 주변 대시 전조 지조세 조라 디기다 하고 거래서 다기 다들이 그 통역이 되어도 직 통역이 되어도 새벽에 되어 여바디 다들이 통역이 되어 여바디 지소도 하고 거래서 하고여도 얘네 그 지소도 가르치면서 술라서 봐 남겨대요 거래서 저기 봐줘요 거래서 주요 거래 지사된 다들이 쑥 통과해서 쑥 통하지 지사된 다직 퇴고도 선배 삼로지 다들이 되네 삼로에도 남사 지소 하고 거래 하고도 자기 남을 주요 거래서 자, 제가 되니기 다 들려 그런 롱주에게 되바 가는 디 롱주에게 다 되는지 고도 선배 삼로다에도 코로나도 남산 지속에 다게 되는 하고 되는 삼코에 지속하고 있는 남산 지속에 콜에 두시는 그런 롱주에 되게 파주용 돼 남유 돼 뭐래 제래다 근데 그런 가르 되어 있는 거 되어 있는 디파 넘버 2 뭐래 제래
So how does the general principle work together with the individual Atmans, with the individual selves? The general principle knows what each Atman wants to experience. Let's say the general principle is aware that various Atmans, herself, want to see something, so experience form. Therefore, the general principle, or thereby the general principle, will emanate form for the various Atmans who are wanting to experience form, will be able to see it. And then the Atmans experience that manifestation. So this is the relationship between the general principle and the Atman. Likewise with sound. The general principle knowing that various selves, various Atmans are wanting to experience sound, then the general principle emanates sound, which is then experienced by, the emanation is then experienced by the individual Atmans.
되게 되어도 되네 다디긴 대롱주거스 대롱주거 강이 받아서 되게 남주 저기 남주 되어 봐 될주가 잡아들래 다기 대롱주거에서는 대 가이드네 따고래서 치료 보고는 저기 다 제가 보고는 저기 다기 롱주에 다 그런 거라서네 아니 뭐 딱봐 라와와 아니 셰바 유하고 한직 되네지라 다스 따고래서 제상 그런 게다 롱주에 되버지도 지소디 그런 롱주에 유디파 주의주연 남유 된지 주의용 거래서 넘버 되고 대도요도 다 그런디 한다디 쑥 통고 쑥디 통고래 자 퇴고래 한로 용고래서 용고할 롱주고래서 되네기 도시 용고래서는 치료보 그런 쪽에 도시는 파르 따고 따고래서 다디 치료비기 조다 다다
So this is this relationship between the general principle and each and every Atman at all times, in that the general principle is aware of what each individual Atman is wanting to experience, and thereby the general principle expresses manifestations or emanations. So maybe manifestations works better. The general principle expresses manifestations, which then the Atmans experience. So this is then the relationship between the two. And the Atman itself is unchanging. It's a knower and it's consciousness. So it's consciousness and it's a knower in the sense that it knows what is being experienced, which has been expressed by the general principle.
제자다 다디 예심보라래 다 세디 디소 치료베 다가스 랍셔겨 말에 코로나 김제 망보지 김제 망보 삼다 제바진 김제 망보 삼다네 다하지 되는 샤오도 선비게 타주지 탐에 타주도 된 리고래 제자다 다 세디 고 지혜요 말해서 딱 말해 거기디나 여여 말해서 땅은 저기 다 세디 제와네 탈버 토겐 다래 녀와 동안 용한 다래 동안 용고래 안에지 대화 용고래 동안 용고래 안에지 탈버 토게 다래 전 다 코로나 누가 가야 주고 말했어 제가 거니만 여여 말해 니네 중으로 니네 매바 차이스 내 요 말해서 다세 제가 다 곧딱 말을 라와요 강래 마도 라와요 되게 니네 시리스 제가 다 거기 맞아 미시리스디 맞아 풍보디 바 로소 쳐야지 풍보디 바 도용도 다 그런 다가라 뒤고마도 다 로소 차요 말했어 요야만 다가 풍보디 제가 가지고 그랬어 근데 맞아 뭐라나 주바래 머리 미치기 제와 다는 뭐라 침보 당다 춘주다 뭐라 간사지 임바지래 가브레 뭐라 니지고 제오지 당다 가브레 교오데 가브레 침보를 다 가브레 춘주 다 되네게 다 쇼로 봐 가브레 넘주로 다야 되네게 미 당한 미치기래데 당사 내 뭐라 가다 말아 여러 안디난시 간사디기 깨와는 가브레 둔돌레 깨와레 가브레레 알하레 깨와 가브레 밀리 깨와 가브레 안디 폼보지 되네게 용고할 때 이나 코론 다 코론을 교화야 말다 되네게 코론을 깨와레 세계다 직 카하하지 용그레스 마도 다 코론 나 교화 주 있기네면 다바 템포레 세지 데 오두스네 코론스 킬린지 거래.
I want to encourage you not just to hear, oh, this is some presentation of some ancient Indian philosophy, I can just dismiss it, it doesn't require much thought. This would be missing the opportunity to learn also about some of the views that we generally hold, that are held within society. So the particular philosophy of the Samkhyas and the other Hindu ancient schools that are presented, they are not just to be dismissed as silly either, because they are based on a lot of reasoning. So it's a developed philosophy. So therefore, we should hear this presentation, see what within it actually those views we just naturally live by or accept, and thereby by understanding the refutation, we will grow as practitioners too. So now to talk a bit about their views. So they hold that the self is permanent. Again, the synonym is unchanging. And this is not too dissimilar from how we relate to ourself, because we think of ourself in the present moment, but we also think of ourself in the past, maybe some hours ago, days ago, decades ago, and it feels like there is some component that is ourself that it hasn't changed, that is unchanging. And when we think about good times and bad times that we have experienced, we take that self that was experiencing happiness and suffering as being unchanging. And likewise, if we imagine our future, we're imagining ourselves in the sense of there's an unchanging self that will experience happiness in the future. Likewise, will eventually be liberated from samsara. And also another thought, but what I'm presenting here is their view, but it's not necessarily something completely alien to us, to the way we seem to naturally think, is that when death comes, our aggregates, our body and mind, this will be left, but the self remains. And it's not, in a way, too dissimilar from exchanging one's car. Once you used one's car, then it's time for a new one, an upgrade, and one now uses another one. But the person driving that car, unchanging. So that's a bit similar. And the self that's gone from life to life, and has been unchanging, this permanent self. In some lives, it arises as the form of a human. Some lives as a human with great power. In other lives as a human who's very weak. In other lives as a god or as an animal. But there's always this self that hasn't changed, that remains life to life.
다디 제라바게 되니게 되다디 나저 삼로 나래 요아리다 가지고 당아서 가서 삼나 가려서네 나 세디 아미키디니 다라 요와 교화메와 생아 다데바도 요데 모바나가 디바도 줘야세데 교화기네 줘야마 다가 요바르 생아도 삼로 요아리 따빠 나서 따빠 삼단 거래 제사다 당아저 디스트로와 베네안저 최진 타골이야 지게 미시교게 탈라망부 샤기도와 예수의 가르침 고라스네 탈라신 다디 디와 요레 삼베 삼로시 코월다 다디 요레 삼고 삼로시 삼고 제사 다디 고 풍부의 메다다 메바서 사르디나 다디 디와 요레 삼베 탈라디자데 딜레 다디 요레 삼베 삼로시 미디 요레 삼베 삼로시 삼나 딩나레 디코고 제사 치료 비게 대자진 베 삼다다디 ngazule kane ba khele na male ma sem ding le ngazule di yorda.
I hope it's clear from what I've just presented that these views are not alien to us. It's not like we're learning about something completely foreign, but these views reside within us. And to repeat the illustration just given, we think there is this unchanging self at a deep level beneath the changing in the body, the changing in the mind, in the aggregates. That is that same self that was born into this world, that has grown, that is experiencing now, and will continue forward. This is how we relate to the self. We apprehend or grasp at it as being unchanging, as permanent. So this is the grasping at permanence in relation to the self. And a further illustration to see how we do this is if you think of how you relate to the ashes of a loved one. You relate to it as if your loved one is abiding in these ashes. So in this way, we can see that these views that have been formulated by the Samkhya is not something that is alien to us at all, but actually abides deep within us.
제산 다디디 요래 선비가 상로를 지어봐야는 탈라디디 샤고래. 되니게 다디면은 탈라샤고스 가만 놈긴 데 수부게 메다다 이치게 탈라디 샤고스 가요 말와 그래서 판도스 가요 말에 응어도 놈이 칼라서 쪼고당 와다 지바로 와디 베지 쪼고디 유고로 베지 스카이 판도스 가요 말와 디는 시스는 탈라디 베지 타 판도스 가요 말와다 제산데 소소이 셈딩리아 탈라디디 다디와 요래 선비 셈딩리 디여봐야나 디샤고래 엔디레 당연히 지난 안디네 있는 저기 다 낭베나 라마다 대속이 단도시는 구수 상제 샤기와 가르레 구수 뒤에 샤기도 알라네 디네서 가가래 고 다디디였으면 라미고 구수디 파 제도 소설야 라마데 진치보다 깨진치보 인자 라미 구디 구수 샤제 라미 구수디 제용도 아주게 라미기 라마레 대버제다 라미기 냐마 소설라 최수는 깨진 경샤바디 깨진 제다 데늘라미 냐마 까나샤게디 냠레체 짐바디 파 냠레 아버지에 마제바제 냠레디 공부도 저 투에게 델리아 아니 캬바치 용거래 데네자 라미고 어제디 샤야디 디레마도 라미기 지게 시산에 라미기 다디 아니 다라디 와쇼레 삼바디 데네 말에
First, as an aside, in Tibetan, one word is used here. It's the same word that in English we have two words. We use the word in English, the two words are ashes and dust, like dust in our house. In Tibetan, it's the same word. And so now to bear that in mind with this translation. So just like in our house, we have dust in our house, doesn't serve much purpose at all, and we relate to it in a particular way. But the dust or ashes of a loved one, this we hold as being of great value, as precious. We put it in a beautiful urn and somewhere respectful. We take something that really is dust, but relate to it as if it has an abiding essence. And now just to say, make a different point here. Should one have, say, the ashes of one's lama, here, these ashes, or this dust, does serve actually a good purpose. Whilst it is still merely dust, because one knows it to be the ashes of one's spiritual teacher, merely by seeing it, or seeing the container, then virtuous minds will arise in dependence on seeing those ashes. Virtuous minds will arise remembering the great kindness of our teacher, remembering his teachings, remembering his hopes for us and all sentient beings. So in this way, the ashes of one's spiritual teacher, they do serve a great purpose. But the ashes of a loved one, general dust, doesn't serve much purpose.
네네 지사당 어레 지당은 저기 비네 군자 망부라 수에신에 Delia, Chimera, as you put it, as you Yanja Puya, and Chu Puya, Mobuchigurova. The ships or me, Jandaji, sometimes Kanza, Dizone, Kukunaris, Garrison, Jada, Dogi, Dene Honsu, Suichi, Delia, Chimuchi, Chu, which is the Carpenter said, Munera, Denigi, sometimes do me sometimes that. Doda Deniji Ka Kushingoma, Doda Denigi Shingilia, Cho, which capture the Shures and Sachim Zigores and Begeda, the some Yunguru Mimobula, the Yunguru Adione.
Let's make maybe a related point. We have these many blessed statues here. You have them in your home too. And what do we do before them? We lower our body, we bow down, we place offerings before them, we fold our hands before them. How does this look to people from outside? In English we have this word, idolatry. This is what it looks like. So to then say explicitly what Genla said, we putting out bowls of water, or folding our hands, or putting ourselves on the floor before a particular shape of metal. This seems very strange to people. So what would we say to someone from outside, so not a Buddhist, who sees this behavior and says to us, do you think that is the Buddha?
Yeah, Jogone Sanje Rebelane Sanje Relamna and the Karikun Sene Sanje Lekono the Zache Rebes. Carson Konozu Sugur was that. Konozu is Sanje Sugu was. She's not that Sanje the Kono Suri, that Sanje Sugan Konosina, Sanje Lekono Zache Chag was. Chipa Miti Lagrua.
So if you say, yes, that is the Buddha, then they may well be a bit confused and say, so the artist who created the Buddha, they must be greater than the Buddha then.
Yeah.
So we say yes, then we have that problem. So if we say no, then it is just a statue. So now that's also difficult.
Yeah, that's Sanje Maris, that's Sanje Marison, Sanje Maruada. Dana, and the council show put the courage in the Pugore said it's that you are not being that they'll lynch Yawarada.
In reality, though, if one has to choose between yes and no, then the answer has to be no. It is not the Buddha. It is a statue. So then this person then will say, then why are you making offerings to it? You recognize, perhaps under a bit of duress, that it is not the Buddha, but you're making offerings, you're prostrating, you're acting in this way. Why?
Di Sanje Seju Kudra di Kundare, Sanju Mone de Mares, Ine Di Kunda de la Patachene, Sanje said the Dinis Yore Sebe, that Di Kunda di Patachene, the Sanje Tisuri, Sanju Mone de Mother Similar J, and the Sanje Dig Gatin J, Sanje Indian J, Sanje Ganzulia, Lamdun Chishi, Sonia di Jangel, Sanje Gatin Tembu Tone, and the Gatin Devaki, Mute. Gunda Deletin, or Sanye Denisuary, these are Digi Sanye and the Tinchimbo, Gatinchimbori, Sembe, and Denchimbori, also Sangele Devaki, good dele Devaki go, my research, those Sangele Devaki, Chichi on those and some diet, those Chico research.
Then, to explain our odd Buddha's behavior, we say, well, it is a statue, or the Tibetan force that we translate as statue literally is similar to the body of. So it is similar to the body of the Buddha. And by relating to it as being similar to the Buddha himself, we relate to it through the qualities of the Buddha as a reminder of the qualities of the Buddha, those qualities that he taught how to develop within each and every one of us. And thereby we remember his teachings and his kindness.
And the Chebu Puedi Nudushin Sanjil Chopu, they do some dash. Benanga Soso Gowini in that, Sosuke Punja in that, Sosuke Pame in that, Tarangu, Tarangu Chili, Yovache, just at a Tarangu Yovana, and Suzuki Digi Barchi Yovana, Mazu Harchig Resena, Midi, Soso Purusina, Bart Tondu, Lamsa, Party Penny to the party taking said some more, but Part Tondu, Soso Budi change, or Budi Lezeva and Jamsi some diet, and the Yawur SMP some diet, Budi Tingle. Tingle party let in the booty tingle. Dinasian Sosuka when you were so permanent. Party down, the party told you that Sosuki D. Minwanity, Delia, and the chicken some time D. Chamsicat, and Delia Nijia Sopa, Sosuka would get D. Ungur, what? She's not Bar Corona Tane. Bar Corona, the toy, the me, toy, the party tungord, party change in the Minwanity, Mazu Jamse some died, some time was some died, your ID party let in Ungur. Bar Coron, meeting a booty party, a booty, some Delia some tango, a booty, and the Baron Boom, party like Rua. And Dinashin, the cheaper chocolate.
Then by seeing the image of the Buddha, seeing the shape that is similar to the body of the Buddha, then we recall the qualities of the Buddha, recall that these teachings by which we will be able to develop those self-same qualities. And with such an appreciation for the Buddha, we make offerings, we prostrate, and so forth. And this can actually be likened, dear non-Buddhist friend, to if you open, well, maybe these days you'd say look at your phone, but in the old days we'd say look in your wallet and you'll see photographs of your children. And especially if your children are far away, maybe abroad, just seeing their picture will bring great joy to your mind, bring us an inner smile will lighten within you. And you may well have the wish, I haven't spoken to them for a while, I want to phone them, or I'd like to buy them a gift, my dear wonderful children. So no one would be confused that that photograph is your child or your children. Very clearly, that is a photograph. But look at the impact it has on you. So too with the statue, with the image of the Buddha. Yes, it's an image of the Buddha, but its purpose is what it invokes within us, and not just merely leading to the arisal of minds of virtue, but the further development of them, the expression of them, and the ongoing training to cultivate those minds within us, those virtuous qualities within us.
That Yangaju Gundalia, Chopuegi, Yumzero, the Pubigi, some Tata Denishi Pugo, Resaji, Jikdire. That Jilia, and Nangaju do soon, Gushan, Denalia, Songpu, Dene Ramneje, Jinlapchin, the dinner, Sued Gunda Redi, in a Gunda Dinalia, Sanki only shoe your res. When the Jinlapche, Molam, Songpu, Jinlapche, there's a that the Sanki only shoe your res. 당저 통해도 군대 통과하는데 디나리아 상기 슈요레스 제산 텔레튜브 상기 모술 상기 원래 셈 군대디 텔리아 상기 슈요되는 상기 공원의 예 선배 삼다지 두체네 초푸에서 상기를 초푸고마도 군대디 아주 쇠셰베다가 상기 말에 신다 도서 쇠셰결이 디인자 텔리아 초회디 말레스 제산은 저 낭비기 군대를 초푸에디 군대쇠 텔리아 송부 람네제 Ramnechin Delia, the good Delia, Sanji Kungo Shuyores, and the Jade Kunda Chigor, and the Seshi Kunda Chigor, Dinalia, Sanji Kungo Shuyes, and big Shuyo Mebache did that, the nigger Shuyo Mebache, Sanji Kungo Bush, Dina Shuyo Bache, and Delia Chopugores, Dush Pugores, did it, a child said the Chopu at the DJ, just a Sanji Winigi. Tell the shoe some Mabache, then Mabache in the sun when you shoe your bache, then and tell us on you when it is Chopuya, Chatsewala Sobachigo, yes, Mado, the Nigi, and the Satuku, Sheshak, did some mares.
Depending on the person you're talking to, maybe you just leave the explanation there, or you can go further. You can explain to them that after the statue was created, and created in a specific way, not with the free imagination of the artist, but in a specific way, it was then also filled with mantras and incense and perhaps other special substances, and filled in a particular way, and thereafter it was consecrated. And the process of consecration is the process of inviting the Buddhas to abide within this statue. And so therefore, we relate to it not merely as metal that has been shaped and painted in a particular way and had various things placed inside of it, but we relate to it as an abode within which the omniscient consciousness of the Buddhas have been invited and abide, and thereby we relate to this statue as being the Buddha. So we relate to it as being the Buddha, although with obvious recognition, it is a statue. But we relate to it as being the Buddha because of the coming together of these various interdependent causes, or these various causes. The creation of a statue in a specific shape and painted in a particular way, filled and then consecrated. And in this way, we relate to it as being a receptacle of the omniscient consciousness of the Buddhas. So I apologize, I've gone on a little bit of a detour, but beyond the meaning of the verse, we spoke about the non-Buddhists, and then we spoke about non-Buddhists in our society and how they may view us. But the point is also that's useful here, is that we need to be educated. We need to understand why we do things. Otherwise, if we just do them because others do them, people will question why we are doing this, that we are maybe a bit silly or brainwashed, and this can lead to some harm. People that could have been benefited actually create a karmic obstacle, a barrier.
Da said da bache and Rawa Jure and Digi and Sula Sutra launch Debaki, then Chizo did Padrish and Sutralis for Jewish, then and Dati to launch your as that Chirubon district or Dennis Chick or as such Mashure. That didn't Ranlu this year. That didn't and Denny Daniel Junshi Denny Daniel Junshi. 중 자세 체도 삼신 중앙에 세대 제사다 다들이 뒤제라서 보체 탐제 다 간사게 롱주게 중앙에게 제사 엔지조디 네디 제호 선배 삼로다제 삼로다네 중앙에 체도 삼 네디 직수호 삼 체도 삼다 쇠바레스는 쇠바레스데디 쇠바레스는 되게 말해서 쇠바레 용어 말해서 그래서 다 호로 딱 봐라 와서 그러다 그래서 지속으로 딱 봐라 왔어. 딱 봐서 좀 걸려야 이게 지속었으면 삼도 따야고 요 말해서 그러다. 이때 요 말 왔어. 제사다 내내게 지속에 되는 주셔비기 다디 론쳐야지 용거 말해. 그래서 다기 그런이 딱 봐 인자 근데 체도 섬제제 배네 대니 다니 중시 중 제시 체도 삼신 중화면서 지속어디 다가 론줘야게 뭐 수자로서 봐도 대화다 대화도 동안라서 와 되는 차상 지속이 되는 제고 선배 삼로 땅진 딩예리야 되는 삼로 땅진 중앙시아 바레스는 중앙 말에 중앙 요 말에 가서 딱 봐라 와서 딱 봐야 되는 중앙 요 말에 사실 디시 된다 디시 월다디 다른 안 주기 되버도 바시월 아 주기 즉 제보디 되는 중앙에 있나 되는 삼단에 규단建起来 되고 그러마다 강来맞대어 봐지 되는 삼단지 요 말에 와딱 봐라 와딱 봐는 삼단 요 말에 와 진짜 중앙 요 말에 딱 봐야 되는 게 중앙 삼단 요 말에 해서지 시월
So returning then to the general principle. So the general principle and the Atman. So the general principle, it emanates manifestations, and then the Atman experiences those manifestations. So both are unchanging. The general principle and the Atman are unchanging and have freedom, free will. So now the third and fourth line. Do not originate with a deliberate thought, I myself shall give rise to. So that the general principle, bearing in mind, it is unchanging. So therefore it cannot perform in the way that Samkhya says it does, because it is unchanging. They say that it is unchanging, but yet can produce results. Through the general principle recognizing that a particular Atman, a particular self, wants to experience something, the general principle thereby emanates that, and then this unchanging self somehow now experiences something. And so what you have in the fourth line, I myself shall give rise to, and then the general principle then emanates something that leads to the experience of happiness or the experience of suffering or a form, a sound, whatever it may be, or leads to the creation of an Atman. So the general principle, according to the Samkhya view, whilst unchanging, yet can create. Now this is impossible. So what we have as the third line, do not originate with a deliberate thought. Because a thought necessarily implies change. But the Atman and the general principle are unchanging. Because if a thought comes and goes, there is a process of change. Or if there's a development of a thought, we engage in a process of thinking. There clearly is change going on. But a permanent phenomenon is unchanging. There's a meaning of being permanent. So therefore, what is presented logically is not possible. Then the 28th verse. If that which has not arisen does not exist, at that time, what could wish to arise? Always drawn to its object, it could also never cease being so.
제보 대화다 동화다 상한 가르치면 제보 기여도 지조되게 개발했으네 지조에 개발 적어서 삼단지 되는 지조되게 개발했으네 지조를 개발되고 와서 제사디 지조를 개발 많이 되는데 지금 말해 그래서는 다디 직당보다 많이 봐 지조 호로 많이 봐 와서 지조 딱 봐라 제사고 많이 봐라 지조 호로 많이 봐래 인상 지조 호로 유견을 때네 많이 봐래 그 믿는 거 말해 그 딱 봐 말해 그 믿어 봐 말해 제사 지조 호로 많이 봐 인상 유견 때네 때네 많이 봐래 그 많이 봐서 콜에 된 지부지야 말해서 원래 지부지야 말해서 마제번에 데메데 지속으로 딱바래 진짜 마제바로 왔어 마제바서 걸 지부지예요 말 진짜 딱바에는 결례된 지부지가 매비 찹스니 매비 마제바데 데메나서 지속으로 유견라 마제바래 마제반사 데 마제나 데라 지부지가 매비 매고 그래스 제사 지부지와 디에서 지속을 되는 게 말했으니 지금 말했어 그래서 지속으로 딱바래 결혼 딱바 켈링도 와 딱바 켈링 바인사 거는 지부지가 용 말했어 this one.
So the first two lines, if that which has not arisen does not exist, at that time, what could wish to arise? So we'll look at the second line first. At that time, what could wish to arise? So this is referring to the general principle, which is again, when we hear this term, think of it as creator, because this is what we're more familiar with in our society. So at that time, what could wish to arise? So this creates, brings things into existence. How could that happen if, now the first line, that it itself hasn't arisen? Why hasn't it arisen? Because it is unchanging. What arises and then abides and then ceases is something impermanent. But this general principle is permanent. So it hasn't arisen and does not exist. So this comes down to that if something is permanent or unchanging, then it cannot be involved in a process of cause and effect, because it cannot it cannot be part of causes or be an effect, because there is no change possible. Whereas causes, they lead to results. Results come from causes. There clearly is an impermanent relationship there, a dependency of causes. But this cannot be the case if the phenomenon is unchanging.
That's significant. Yula takdo yen gurbi gabar jua mai no sede da dadi le segura. Dadi takwa ina tako jua jua me was. Chesan gedi ina yulpa yudi zindu gores, yen gua sede yulpa yen se yul zimba segura. Yele zingores. Yulla takdo yen gurba sede 다디 딱바 인자 고 유진데 다고 유함 근에 매바 게디나 유디 진도 거래스 데네 진도 바나 게디나 유디 진제 가바 근에 가야 근에 매den시 되고로 와스 세상한테 되어 있나 데네 되네 지금 말해스 그래서는 bên 가브레레 가스다디 고 자진요도 자디 게디지 예줘요 자 저쪽으로 와스 자디 bên 매도로 치는데 매도 봐 감제 매바 차로요 와스 제가 다디 매도 진데 게디나 매도 진되바디 레베스네 디 마레스 그래서 매도 코로 안에 가서 오래 예제 깜보체 매바 차로도 디니 매도 진베 다디 매바 차고 와서 제가 매도 매바 쳐 유디 매바 쳐도 디 진행 가 다디 용 말로 와서 매도 매나 매도 진되네 진해지 용 말로 와 제가디 요 말로 와서 제가 디니 인자 결혼기 다 딱바레세 디고 말레스 다 딱바 이나 유디 진제 게디나 유디 진 되어 가지고 가야 매바 되고 그랬대 디네 민도 와서 그래서 유디 매바 차도 디진메 다데 매바 차로 와서 제가다 디네자 가야 균이 매세디 디고 말레스 제가 결혼 다 딱바레세디 디고 말레스 지도 순걸 된다디 지나 데리 메체 규기요데스 그것은 키알라소파 키에당시 데니 딱딱바데 샤리스 메토데 규기요데스 데니 디스키마데 제가 다고라 딱바네 메도 진되바노고 메도 진주 유어균이 매바치 게디나 되고로 와다 지난 디 되나 가야 균이 매면 데니 되고로 람나 니 디기 민도 오스 가르스니 메도에 감네 매바 차르데 데니 다디 메도 진야 민도 와스 지난 메도 진야 다디 샤야 민도 와스 제가 데니 인자 디고 다 딱바래라 디고 말레스 고 유디 메나 디진베 다디 용고 말레스 제가 유 다디 디진베 다디 유메세 유디를 뛰고 그래서 메도도 유나고 메도 진거래 메도도 매바 차선 거라는 다 메도 진베 다디 매바래 자디 매바 차도 자진엔 다디 매바 차도 그래 제가 메도 그래 제가 디 딱바래서는 디고 말레스
And the third and fourth line presents a clear consequence of believing in in the self or the Atman or the general principle being permanent, always drawn to its object, it could also never cease being so. So a permanent phenomenon, so let's rather use the synonym, an unchanging phenomenon can never change direction because it is unchanging. So if it was in a particular direction, it could only ever be in that direction. It couldn't change to another direction. It couldn't cease being, because if it were to cease, it would have changed. So to give an illustration of this, that let's say this Atman is apprehending a flower. Now a flower, we know, it grows, it abides, it blooms and abides, and then it wilts and dies. The flower is going through a process of change. But if the Atman apprehending that flower were unchanging, there would be a problem, because the flower that it is engaging with is changing. But the apprehending Atman somehow cannot change. But if the flower is growing, what is appearing to this Atman is clearly changing, but this Atman is supposed to be unchanging. But there is change, and eventually the flower will not just have wilted and died, but it will be completely gone. But this unchanging Atman, what is it now apprehending? Because the flower is long gone. So this is a clear consequence of believing that the self is permanent.
다 랑와도 마주바 다도 마주바레 세디레 다도 마주바 세디 다 코로 요마레 메 라고 마레 다도 마주바 세 다 랑와도 두바도 요마레 세오다 제사다 랑와도 두바도 요바이나 메비 김선 시워다 다 랑와도 두바도 메바레 메바 가르스네 다 세디 랑와도 두드요바이나 코로 유디 가르 침바나디 제미도 제사 다 세디 유디를 뛰고 다디 유 침바디 유를 뛰고도 와스 유디 예나 코지 메나 min zhemi duwas chesada yudi tadi yudi zimbazi sedi yudi le dewu duwas chesada ben zharo chi suk chu yeba ina dadi suk tong de su yeba le su de me ba cha de dadi suk me tong ya cha lu chesada dadi suk tong ya de la da ho la rang yo ma yu le dewu duwas chesada da sedi rang ge zhu be da jing ang zu le yo ma le nang ba la chesada rang de zhu be da ji yo ba na ko yudi ga zi zimbe na 다랑 유어 유니메가 지친 되어거든 요면도 와서 매도로 신의 걸 예되는 인바지 마조로 자로 지나도 두신 시루고 수다 차상 두시 교주고 와서 진짜 되는상 매도도 매바차도 매도 통하게 다요 말 가서 매도 걸어 매바서 다디 매도 통발 와서 진짜 매도 통하게 다디 매도 통할 매도로 뛰고도 와서 자퇴발을 자들을 뛰고도 제가 다디 유통하지 랑원도 롱제요 말 유들을 뛰고래서 제가 랑원도 주비게 다지요 말해서 현재를 마디비 다지요 말해서 디니시에도 다가지 다 매바르스는 가지고 동방이나 다미베 남샤티 파치 덴마 송고 다던다 딜리고래
To repeat the point I made when we started to look at the previous verse, that guard yourself from thinking, what is the point of hearing about these non-Buddhist schools? These aren't views I hold, because I'm sure no one here identifies as a Samkhya. But actually, there is great purpose in hearing these views and taking what we hear and applying it to our own way of thinking. Because we do relate to the self as being unchanging. Whereas what Buddhists assert is that the self is dependent but lacks free will. And this is contrary to certainly what non-Buddhists tend to teach. So by understanding the non-Buddhist presentation, seeing how much of that we actually relate to, we naturally relate to, we can then overcome our own misapprehensions of the self. And this will aid our understanding of selflessness. So now to return to these two lines we just looked at, that the self necessarily is dependent. It engages with objects. So there's a relationship of interdependence or mutual dependence, in that it can, if it's apprehending an object such as a flower or sound, there is a interdependent relationship. It cannot exist independently or free of relations with anything at all.
Jeza da se di moyo sonya liya benanga juge da drupa rangwa du drupa yo mare se da rangwa du drupa yo mare se jeza da rangwa ne ma drupa dela da me ba si ro da rangwa ne ma drupa se temba ma drupa se ro jeza tongba ni se ro da me ba si ro jeza da rangwa ne ma drupa se jeza da don da la ngo rangwa ne drupa ma ro se di da se ji xian chi le mo de ma de ba chi xian gang lai ma de ba chi yo ba ne da rangwa du yo ba de. Then the dealing needs to how quiet the so the person Rama to you may say the Shenjila Matubachi Yuna and Rama to Yubachi. The Shenjula Matubachi Mebanza Rama to Mebalis. She's not that said the Shenjula doing it to go as a Rama to you Mebalis. She's not that Rama to you may said, she's not that Rama to your Maria said, Dushin Dada, Dushi Chakari in Rama to your Maria. That Shenjila Matuba drooped the mere round Mebalis. She's under Dushi Chitty, Giji Jijo by the Yudan Yen, Dugo, Giji Jiba, the Tawaya Maris, Dasa, Tawa Mare, Dasi, Yudan Yen, Dugo, she's on Horon Das and Mobo in Zan, Horon Yutungo, Chikahako, she's on Mobile, Mobo in Zan, Yudan Yen, Duba, Giji Jijo, Tawaya Maris, Dondala the Hawadi. Kiji Majiba and the Jijoba and Tapa Tadi Tapa Mares, Tadi Kiji Mitabares. That Dadi Rawan Mares, Tasadi, Castin, change it doing it to go Duba in the Rawan Mares, Cesati Dugor was, that they have wedding on the Dinis to did it. So Rosh. Cesatanga, nobody's. Cousin Judah Kin, the Dugor, then the Kiji Chigor Tapa Mares.
In the meditation on selflessness or emptiness, we come to recognize that the self is not free, does not have free will, in that it is not independent. It is empty of being independent. If the self were independent, it would have free will. It would not be dependent on anything at all. It would be, it would have its own free will. But that is not how it exists. Rather, it is dependent arising, and it changes momentarily. So it's a dependent arising, it depends on imputation, it depends on causes, and it depends on parts, moments of time. Sorry, leave parts out there. It depends on causes, it depends on imputation by mind. It is a functioning thing. So we come to recognize two components to the self. One, it's not unchanging or permanent. It changes momentarily. Secondly, it is not independent, but dependent. Dependence on causes, dependence on labeling. So therefore, it is also a functioning thing.
Sesadi Koraji Dini Sang Nambari ne Jerama or Deba Sem Zamba, Umaranju, Matenjubasen, Tang was on that little meter Yungore. I've been arousal sometime and arousal Da said Sosanga said Sirotanga said Lagorote, Nayore, Nakalasa, Nakiu, Nadunga, Nakiu, Medanga Lego said, Na said Yorwa down there. The Sosara and Wilson said in Wilson, but the condition was so sad. Ni Lapa and Gade, Le Codi Gade Lagrimaro. Suputing Arema like Marwa, Tanga some Nana Kayore, Ma said, Subutile, Loso, Zubutia, Maike, 나 삼나 가야 만게 나세도 직 만주 풍부들 맞대봐 그런 예리 봐서 신나 샬고로 왔으면 되네 샬고로 와 디자들 라원도 요바디 샬고로 당아 줄이야 제상가 라원도 나왔어야 돼 장원이 두바 능고래 제상 치료비 섬다야 따따 줄래 섬나 리디고래 제사디 도시 섬단 소소한데 심주시에들이다 당아저도 섬다데 나사데 나요르스게 나 데데 드링가 레갈레 드링가 칼라사 띵아 티우면도 나 데오도 세시거든 나데 그게래샤스 다티도 신의 소식이 수분 마 제바치네 당에 라바데 레베스 신의 라바데 말은 가야 띵에 라바레 라기도 와서 고디야 말했어 다도 신의 나올로 집에네 되네 나올로레 안치게 규마다 닝다 로아다 레렌zen 나를 디서 나 말했으 이 수부의 차실마다 나를 말 받아 세상 디네서도 오신 나한테 가와도 쓰다 디네 심주시는데 탐에 다줄 나 디도 세데 먼저 영어 손에 고로 받아 네가 저기 심주시 고거다
To identify the self is actually difficult to do. Hence the Buddha taught this process. Hence, the Buddha taught various presentations to guide students to come to recognize selflessness. So he had to teach many different presentations because it is difficult to do. So he taught the Vaibhashika, the Sautrantika, the Chittamaja, and the Madhyamaka's teachings to try and guide students to recognize the self and then to recognize, to seek it out and to see whether it exists in the way that it appears or not. But to recognize, identify the self, this is difficult to do. And perhaps all too easily, one can come to a superficial understanding of the process of the meditation and think you've got it. But unless one is really, it has a radical impact, one probably, despite thinking you've identified the self, actually haven't yet. So for example, when we're looking for the self, we'll recognize this I, the self, this I. It appears like right now, I am listening, I am thinking. Earlier, before I had supper, I was hungry, then I was eating. So there's all these references to the I. So what is this I? So is it maybe my body? And we can easily say, oh, it's not my head, it's not my arm, it's not any of the components in my body. So this we can do easily, and then, oh, I'm not my body. But then as soon as we have an ache or a pain, or someone comments on our body, then we have a reaction to that, as if that is our I. So we haven't looked yet that deeply. But when we do look a bit deeper, we're seeing, okay, I can't be my body parts or this collection of parts, nor if I look in the various divisions of consciousness, can I find the I? But there is still something, this I, the self, that is present now, and I expect to be here tomorrow, and that was here some years ago and lives ago. So there is still something that we relate to as the I, that's other than the body and the mind, the aggregates. So this is this self that is being referred to here, this independent I, this I that is independent of the body and mind, that is unchanging. So through what I've just said here, I hope you really see the relevance of understanding the Samkhya position, or the position of the non-Buddhist. There'll be others to come, to see how we naturally think in these ways and take these techniques and add them to our meditation.
텐주비기 쇼네 셰바 나신 칭아세디 하고나 또바인다 근데 아주 동반이 두고래 또 두고래 그래서 텐주비기 나세디 파 풍부가 뭐 가르치리야 뢰파 따바 잠지여바마도 뢰 따바 잠마이바 랑모인도 줍듯이요 말해서 순거로 제가도 제심이시다 오다 나세디 뢰파 따바 잠지래도와 디마도 민도와 선배 삼레베나 레토바나 데네 텐유미 쇼네 시베 동반이 네스디 함하고 거래 이거 아주 미답이 거기. 그 현실에 맞대고 주고 요말세데 미답을 거셔야지 변천을 빼야돼.
So I just want to thank you for the illustration of impermanence. We have been speaking about the grasping at permanence, and sometimes impermanence becomes very, very visible. So thank you for that intentional display. So when we engage in this process of investigation, we aspire at least to come to realize how phenomena exist and do not exist in accordance with the view of Prasangika, because then one has come to the correct realization of emptiness. So in terms of all phenomena, but in relation to the self, the I exists merely as labeled by mind onto the aggregates. So this is the final result that one comes to. And one perhaps can come to it quite easily just by having learnt a bit and gone through the steps. But one needs to come to it through a point of deep negation, whereby the various wrong views that influence us so are chipped away and eventually eradicated. Then one actually will come to realize emptiness and have this transformative impact. But then we'll conclude here for this week. Or there's a question?
Earlier in the night, you mentioned in regard to permanent phenomena, you mentioned that it needs to be known by a valid cognizer. And the general principle is a permanent phenomenon. So if it's all knowing, why would it need to be known?
So a permanent phenomenon needs to be known by a valid cognizer in order to exist. So it's dependent on being known by a valid cognizer. But if the general principle is all-knowing, why would it even need to be known? Okay.
맞죠, 라와레스. Didi. 지조 딱바레 라왕레 차산 싱그리라 근데 치료비 걸어서 되다지 시호래 치료비 되다지 但안주기 가르선 지조도 여가 있나 현실에 뛰어오래 그런 예비게 참말로 뛰어오래 해야 되는 거 낭비 시다데 이 시단 걸어서 되고 가가자래 여발에 또 참말로 뛰어오고 말에 혼자로 뛰어오고 말에 라와 여래
So the Samkhyas would agree with you to the extent of saying, there's no need for a valid cognizer to know the general principle. Why are you even asking this? So why are we asking that? Well, that's just from the perspective of the Buddhists. The Buddhists say permanent phenomenon are also dependent arisings. Whereas so therefore you Samkhyas, we don't agree with your assertion. You say permanent phenomena are free. Or this permanent phenomenon is free, the general principle. It doesn't require, it's not dependent. Whereas we as Buddhists say you are mistaken because it is actually dependent. How so? For something to exist, it needs to be known. It needs to be known and known by a valid cognizer. So it needs to be correctly known, validly known. So this would be the response from the Buddhists to the Samkhya view. Whereas their view is, like you said, why does the general principle? Well, the general principle doesn't need to be known because it is all-knowing. So there's just no need to even think about it.
Nangbe labyo de chorang la ye jiso se dine khang yo ma le la wo le. Dine ge gyke la ma de ba da ba rang yun cha sang xin de dine ji yo ma le la wo chorang labyo de.
So the Buddhists would be saying to the Samkhyas that what you are asserting cannot exist. And why? Because permanent phenomena need to be known. They need to be known by a valid cognizer. So what you are saying logically doesn't make sense. You are just asserting a view. But logically, for this reason, it doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Thank you.